I read the announcement at 10 o'clock sharp. The espresso was better than usual, dark, acidic, and perfectly still in the cup. I sat in a quiet marina cafe watching the San Francisco fog retreat from the bridge. No one in this neighborhood knew my name, which remained my most valuable asset. Donald called right as I finished the final sip. He had seen the headline too. The board had made its move, and Mackenzie was finished. I told him we would talk later. This outcome wasn't luck. It was a long-term strategy that began with a brown envelope 17 months ago. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized someone you loved was actually treating you like a transaction? What would you have done in my place? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have waited for the math to reveal the truth? Mackenzie didn't say hello. She just dropped the envelope. It was a Friday morning in April. She was dressed in her usual board meeting armor, a structured blazer, heels, and that specific shade of deep red lipstick she only wore when she planned to be aggressive. I was sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's shirt, nursing a cold coffee and reading a technical manual. The manila folder landed next to my mug with a dry, clinical thud. She didn't break her stride. She was already scrolling through her phone, managing her calendar and directing her empire. "My lawyers drafted something," she said, her voice flat and logistical. I recognized that tone. It was the same one she used for lease renewals or vendor terminations. I should have done it from the beginning. I've worked too hard to leave anything to chance. I looked at the letterhead on the envelope. It was a postnuptial agreement, a legal reset button. We had been married for 2 years. She tapped a specific paragraph. "I've included a mutual waiver for final financial disclosure," she added. "It keeps things efficient. Neither of us has to open our full books to the other's lawyers." She grabbed her bag and walked toward the door without a second glance. She hadn't kissed me goodbye in 7 months. I had counted every single day. I sat there alone in the quiet of our Pacific Heights home. The folder felt heavy against the wood of the table. 11 pages. Her signature was already on page 9, neat and final. Paper clipped to the front were her lead attorney's business cards. I read every word of that document, and on page 6, my entire financial existence was described as unverified and presumed minimal. Looking back now, that was the moment the bridge burned. It wasn't anger that shifted in my chest. It was clarity. My mind drifted back to a Wednesday night in late February 2020, the Stanford alumni mixer. I was standing near the back by the shrimp cocktail, nursing a club soda and trying to be invisible. That is where the real people stand, the ones who do not need to perform. My college buddy Donald had practically dragged me there. He told me I was becoming the kind of man who names his houseplants. I told him I didn't own any plants. He told me that was worse. Mackenzie found me that night. I know that now. At the time, I just thought I was lucky. She appeared beside me like she had been there the whole time. "You're not working the room," she said. I looked at the frantic networking happening around us and replied, "Neither are you." She actually laughed, not the practiced kind you hear at these things. She told me she was the director of a venture capital fund in Palo Alto. She was sharp, funny, and she looked at me like I was a puzzle she hadn't quite solved. If I'm being honest, I should have recognized that look. I have used it myself when evaluating a high-yield asset. Love often makes us overlook the exclusion clauses in a person's character until the grace period has already expired. We see the potential for connection while they are calculating the projected return on investment. I looked back at the 11-page document on the table. Mackenzie thought she was protecting herself from a modest man with a comfortable life. She had no idea she was handing a weapon to the person who had designed the game. I played the part of the useful husband perfectly. For 2 years, I stood exactly 3 feet behind her at galas and private dinners, wearing a modest watch and an even more modest expression. I was her most effective piece of branding. A venture capital director needs an anchor, someone who suggests roots, ethics, and a life outside of spreadsheets. My family's technology farm in the Central Valley provided exactly that. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of old-world stability that gave her New World fund a sense of legitimacy she hadn't earned. When her institutional investors asked about her long-term vision, she pointed to our marriage as proof of her grounded nature. I let her use that light. I stood in the corners of silent ballrooms, watching her charm men who only cared about her projected exit multiples, while I remained her favourite artisanal accessory. My friend Donald, the same man who is now my lead counsel, refused to let the imbalance slide. At a fundraiser in late 2021, he pulled me into a quiet hallway. He had a look of pure, professional frustration. "Garrett, she introduces her company's third-quarter earnings with more warmth than she introduces you," he said, his voice low and sharp. I laughed it off at the time and told him she was just under pressure, but Donald saw the math I was trying to ignore. He saw that I had become a silent investor in a version of family where I was the only one footing the emotional bill. I was the secondary collateral in a primary deal. It took me years to understand that my patience wasn't rooted in hope, but in a deeper instinct for preservation. Looking back, I realized I was caught in the invisible chain of a survivor. I had watched my father fight for every acre of our land, and I knew that sometimes you have to endure the storm to keep the soil from washing away. My silence wasn't an act of submission, it was a tactical delay. I stayed in that role, performing the duties of the supportive spouse, because I knew that any sudden movement would alert her to the fact that I was actually observing the exits. I was waiting for the mask to slip, and when it finally did, the impact was clinical. The file wasn't hidden behind a complex password. It was sitting in a subfolder of our shared drive labelled Archive, a place where old tax records and insurance policies went to be forgotten. I was looking for our homeowner's insurance renewal on a rainy Sunday evening in November 2022 when I took a wrong turn through the directory. My cursor hovered over a PDF titled Exit Strategy R. My first thought was that it was a very clean, professional font for something that was about to ruin my Sunday. I opened it, and for exactly 4 minutes, I didn't breathe. It was 12 pages of clinical, cold-blooded planning. Mackenzie hadn't just been living with me, she had been managing me like a distressed asset. The document laid out a 5-year timeline. Year 2 was for consolidating joint accounts. Year 3 involved leveraging my family's technology patents to secure fresh capital for her fund. Year 5 was the finish line, initiate dissolution. On page 7, I found the name Brent Calloway. He was her associate, a man with smooth hair, who had called me buddy at 3 different company dinners. In Mackenzie's strategy, Brent wasn't just a colleague. He was listed as the alternate asset manager for when I was removed from the equation. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. I needed something to occupy my hands, so I started making pasta from scratch. There is a specific kind of focus that only comes from kneading dough, a rhythmic labour that demands your presence. As the flour dusted the counter, the weight of the betrayal settled into something harder than grief. At the time, I didn't realise that Mackenzie hadn't chosen me in spite of my quiet life. She had chosen me because of it. I was the perfect financial hiding place, a man with deep roots and no ego who could neutralise the noise from her restless investors. Looking back now, I see that this was the moment my heartbreak ended and my calculation began. When you realise you are a strategy rather than a human being, the emotional lease is terminated immediately. I wasn't her husband. I was a subscription she was planning to cancel once the promotional period ended. I had been a silent investor in their version of family, but I was done footing the bill for a lie. Mackenzie came home at 8:47 that evening. She dropped her bag and sniffed the air. "Something smells good," she said. I plated the meal and poured a glass of wine. "Slow roasted brisket," I replied. "It takes 12 hours to get the smoke right. Patience is the main ingredient." Sit down. We ate, and she told me about her day. I told her about mine, giving her the heavily edited version she expected to hear. I smiled at the right times. I didn't flinch. While she slept that night, I stared at the ceiling and began to build a board of my own. Mackenzie thought she was the only one with an exit strategy. She was wrong. Donald landed at San Francisco International on the first Saturday of April with a heavy briefcase and the focused energy of a man who makes his living in the shadows. We didn't go to my house in Pacific Heights. Instead, we met in a small, windowless office I had rented in the financial district under a management company Mackenzie had never heard of. She thought my only workspace was our kitchen table. That was exactly the point. We spent that weekend building a ghost. We registered a new holding entity in Delaware called Harland Ridge LLC. In the world of high finance, boring names are the best camouflage. For the next 8 months, I maintained a performance that would have won an Oscar. I was the attentive, modest husband she expected. I cooked, I listened to her complaints about unreasonable investors, and I accompanied her to the Presidio for our Sunday morning walks. But behind that facade, I was taking over her world. Through Harland Ridge and a series of secondary entities, I quietly acquired a 12% stake in her own venture capital fund. I targeted the secondary shares her early investors were desperate to offload. To her, Harland Ridge was just another faceless institutional buyer helping her liquidity she never thought to look behind the curtain. I moved through the shadows of her industry, purchasing the debt of her most critical freight suppliers in Fresno and Chicago. These companies were operating on thin margins and were desperate for capital. I gave it to them on the condition of total anonymity. If I'm being honest, there is a cold satisfaction in sitting across from your wife while she vents about a difficult investor or an unyielding supplier, knowing that both of those people report to you. This wasn't a loud confrontation. It was a clinical realignment of power. The most strategic move involved Brent Calloway. Donald discovered that Brent was quietly shopping for an anchor partner for his own side investment fund. I provided the capital, but I insisted on 4 separate layers of legal separation. Brent had called me buddy at 3 separate dinners, smiling while he helped Mackenzie draft my replacement. Now, without knowing it, he was working for my money. Looking back now, I realize that true power doesn't scream. It doesn't need to flip a table or make a scene. It sits quietly in the background, waiting for the paperwork to be finalized. One morning, while Mackenzie was stressing over a quarterly audit, I realized that I didn't just own a part of her company, I was the foundation it was built on. We encountered friction when a bank in Palo Alto flagged one of our larger transfers. Donald had to pivot quickly, using an offshore trust to bridge the transaction and satisfy their compliance department. It was a tense 48 hours, but we stayed under the radar. By the time the dust settled, the board was set. Harland Ridge held her debt, her suppliers, and her associates' future. Everything was in position for the 5th year she had so meticulously planned. She just didn't know I had moved the finish line. The pressure finally broke through the surface on a Tuesday evening. Mackenzie came home late, but she didn't drop her bag. She kept it clutched like a shield. She stood in the center of our living room, her eyes darting between me and the kitchen table. "I need that signature, Garrett," she said, her voice brittle for the first time. "The fund is facing a liquidity crisis, and I need to show my partners that our household assets are legally fortified." When I didn't reach for the pen, she took a step closer, dropping the mask of the supportive partner. "Think about the farm," she threatened. "The high-tech irrigation project. Your family spent years developing. I control the capital flow for that. If you don't sign by midnight, I'm pulling the funding." It was a calculated strike at the one thing she knew I loved. She thought she was squeezing my hand, but she was really just showing me how empty her own was. Looking back now, I realized this was the moment of the empty wallet illusion. People like Mackenzie build empires out of other people's labor and debt, convincing themselves that the numbers on a screen are a replacement for character. She was screaming about power while standing on a foundation of shifting sand. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a woman who had traded every real connection for a high-stakes performance that was finally falling apart. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Donald. I excused myself to the hallway and took the call. "It's worse than we thought," Donald said, his voice flat. "She didn't just draft a document to protect assets. She weaponized the ones you already have. I found a $20 million credit line secured against your family's seed genetic patents. She buried a limited power of attorney inside those irrigation permits you signed last fall. She legally hijacked your legacy to cover her fund's insolvency." The air in the hallway felt thin. Mackenzie hadn't just betrayed our marriage. She had crossed the line into criminal fraud. She wasn't just a strategist anymore. She was a desperate woman trying to outrun a felony. This wasn't a civil disagreement. It was a crime scene. I walked back into the living room, where she was still waiting with the pen. "One way or another, Garrett, this ends tonight," she said. I looked at her, felt the weight of the 47-page counter dossier sitting in my office downtown, and nodded. "You're right, Mackenzie," I said. "It does end tonight." I invited them to Donald's office on the 34th floor of a glass-walled building in Palo Alto. Mackenzie arrived with Gary Ostroff, a senior partner with 23 years of experience, who looked like a man used to winning by attrition. She was back in her armor, the structured blazer, the sharp heels, the red lipstick. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and impatience. She thought she was here to witness my final surrender. "You've had the weekend to think, Garrett," she said, her voice smooth and clinical. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Donald didn't say a word. He simply sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, watching them. I picked up the pen and signed her 11-page prenuptial agreement without a single edit. Ostrov looked surprised. He had likely prepared for an hour of bickering over furniture and joint checking accounts. Mackenzie let out a breath that sounded like a bored exhale. She thought the game was over. "Thank you, Garrett," she said, reaching for the signed document. "It's better this way." "It is," I said, leaning back. "But now we need to discuss the second set of terms." Donald reached into his briefcase and placed a 47-page dossier on the glass table. It was bound in black, heavy, and silent. Mackenzie's plan had been 11 pages of defensive posturing. Mine was 47 pages of structural acquisition. Ostrov opened the document first. I watched his eyes move fast at first, then stopping abruptly. He slowed down, his posture stiffening as he reached page 10. He looked at Mackenzie, then back at the paper. He stood up and closed the heavy oak door to the conference room. "What is this?" Mackenzie asked, her voice losing its edge. "This is Harland Ridge, LLC," Donald said, his voice flat and professional. "It is the entity that currently holds 80% of your fund's outstanding debt. It is also the majority shareholder in your two primary freight suppliers in Chicago and Fresno. And, as of 3p pounds, Misjusjun yesterday, Harland Ridge has exercised its option to convert that debt into a 12% equity stake in your fund." The blood drained from Mackenzie's face so quickly I thought she might lose consciousness. She looked at the dossier like it was a living thing that could detonate. "You can't do that," she whispered. The investors sent wedding flowers to protect their capital, Mackenzie," I said quietly. "They aren't loyal to you. They are loyal to the foundation. And I am the foundation." Donald turned to page 32. "We also have the forensics on the $20 million loan authorization you secured against the seed patents. The use of that power of attorney was an unauthorized act of fraud and misappropriation. If this reaches your board of directors, you won't just lose your job, you will lose your freedom." Ostrov tried to counter, mentioning a possible lawsuit for market manipulation, but Donald silenced him with a single look. "Mr. Ostrov, your client signed an airtight prenuptial agreement 3 minutes ago that protects all of Garrett's assets, including Harland Ridge. You drafted the shield, we simply used it. Mackenzie sat perfectly still. The silence in that room lasted for a full minute, but it felt like 40. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the humming of the air conditioner and the distant foghorn on the bay. That singular, heavy minute of realization. A woman seeing the truth as she realized she had spent 2 years underestimating a man who had already bought every exit she was planning to use. Looking back now, that silence was the most honest conversation we ever had. The door clicked shut behind them. Mackenzie walked toward the elevator without looking back, and Gary Ostrov followed her like a man walking to his own funeral. There were no cameras, no police sirens, and no shouting. In the world of high finance, a total collapse often sounds like nothing more than a heavy door closing in a quiet hallway. The aftermath was clinical. The board of directors stripped Mackenzie of her title as director of the fund within 72 hours. An internal audit was launched to investigate the unauthorized use of the seed genetic patents. To avoid a federal indictment, Mackenzie signed a private settlement agreement. She traded her townhouse and her remaining personal accounts to satisfy the debt, walking away from Palo Alto with a ruined reputation and a personal debt load that I now effectively controlled through Harland Ridge. I didn't stay to watch the debris hit the ground. I drove south, back to the Central Valley, back to the farm that had been the anchor of my life long before Mackenzie walked into that mixer. The air there is heavy, with the scent of turned soil and irrigation. Water, real things that don't depend on a venture capital multiple to exist. I stood on the porch that first evening with a glass of Napa Red, watching the sun set over the high-tech irrigation lines. The farm was mine, secure and silent. Looking back now, I realize that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I had spent 2 years being a silent investor in Mackenzie's version of family, footing the bill for her ambition with my own identity. If I'm being honest, I think I wanted her to be real, even after I found the strategy file in that subfolder. I wanted the woman from the mixer to exist outside of her own clinical calculations. But you cannot negotiate with a person who only sees you as a strategic asset. It took me years to understand that the quietest guy in the room is usually the most dangerous one, not because of his money, but because he is the only one who isn't performing. Mackenzie was so focused on the stage that she forgot to check who owned the floor she was standing on. True power doesn't scream. It sits quietly in the background, waiting for the 60-day grace period to expire and the final notice to be served. Donald stops by the farm occasionally now. We sit on the porch and don't talk about quarterly results or exit strategies. We talk about the next harvest and the way the light hits the valley in the late afternoon. I didn't win because I was richer. I won because I was willing to wait while she chose to trade a human connection for a series of data points. Some legacies are built in glass buildings, but those can be shattered by a single 47-page dossier. My legacy is in the land. It is in the patience of a man who knows that some things don't break all at once. They erode until there is nothing left to hold them up. I am okay now. Better than okay. I am still. And in the quiet of this valley, I have finally found a version of home that doesn't require a prenuptial agreement to protect. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective. How do you reclaim your value when the people closest to you have already decided you are minimal?